Welcome to Australian Hiker, your online hiking resource. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage.
This is episode 170 of the Australian Hiker podcast. And in this week's episode, we're talking about finding water on a hike. Now, when we're at home, we take for granted the availability of water. We just walk to the tap, walk to the fridge, or if we're out and about shopping, we'll just go to a store or a takeaway and get a bottle of water or get something to drink as we need to. When we're hiking, particularly in the more remote areas, the availability of water can become a bit more of a complex issue. On shorter hikes, we'll typically carry a bottle or a water bladder of some sort and carry enough water to do us through for that hike. But for overnight hikes or longer day hikes or multi-day hikes, we may need to be able to source water off the trail from natural sources. In this week's episode, we're going to discuss the options for locating water while on a hike, ranging from the simple to the more complex. And we're also going to look at what appropriate hydration is for a hike. We hope you enjoy. Now, the first thing we want to talk about is what is appropriate hydration. Now, essentially, water is one of those things, along with air and food, that we need to be able to go through and survive. And while we can actually go anywhere up to 30 to 40 days, not necessarily in a healthy way, without food, water is a whole different matter. And it's generally an accepted thing that we as in most humans, can go around about 3 days without having adequate hydration. Once we get to that sort of stage, we're not going to be too flash. And in fact, normally once you get to sort of the 3-day period, we're getting onto the point of view where it can be fatal. And there has been accidents in the Northern Territory over the last couple of weeks where a hiker actually did die from dehydration, and that was only after a couple of days. But with the excessive heat at this time of the year, that's probably understandable.
That'd be a pretty harsh way to go, and quite, I guess the understatement is unpleasant.
Now, the thing that most people are concerned about when they're hiking is dehydration. And this is probably the thing that most impacts us as hikers. Usually it tends to be in a minor way, but it can be fairly serious if we're not paying attention. So dehydration occurs when more fluids leave the body than enter. Now, I said fluids here. It doesn't necessarily have to be water. I know a lot of people who rarely ever drink water at all. They'll drink fruit juice or fizzy drinks, but they need to get some sort of water or fluid back into their system. So dehydration at its least effect can be fairly minor, or at worst can be life-threatening. Now, the signs and symptoms of dehydration, in a mild case, you're thirsty, you're dry mouth or lips and tongue, you may have a headache, you might be dizzy or lightheaded, and probably the most obvious one is dark-coloured urine. And we've actually got a little chart as one of the articles associated with this podcast that shows you what the urine colour should be. But, if your urine is dark brown in colour, it probably means you are really dehydrated.
That's pretty bad, yeah. That's not good.
And usually by that stage, you're normally not starting to feel the best as well. So I think as an unpleasant a topic to talk about as it is, so use urine colour as being a good guide to how your hydration is going. Now, if hydration or dehydration becomes really severe, you can have an increased breathing rate, your heart rate can be increased and your blood pressure can actually drop. You're producing little or no urine. Now, it's not going to be the case that you always want to go to the toilet, but if it's a really hot day and you're drinking lots and lots of water and you don't feel like you need to urinate, it's probably a good indication that you are either dehydrated or you're heading in that direction. Something that's less common from a point of view, but can be equally as serious, is overhydration. And this is something that a majority of people don't even consider, particularly in Australia's harsh, warmer climate. Typically, this is far less a common problem than dehydration and tends to affect endurance athletes, so people that are doing ultra marathons or long distance running, military people who are doing training exercises, particularly in the hotter conditions because they often tend to be carrying a lot of heavy gear, and surprise, surprise, hikers, particularly in tropical areas. And there have been a number of cases where hikers have died from overhydration. And the last one, and there's a link in this, one of the associated articles that goes back to, I think it was around about 2011, where a number of hikers died on the Kokoda Trail in Papua New Guinea because they were drinking too much water to avoid getting dehydrated, but they actually went the other direction.
And when we're talking about drinking too much water, I mean, we're talking litres and litres and litres. And normal everyday volume, people say, drink 2 litres of water, but we're talking about many times that, aren't we?
Yeah, and we'll talk about how much we should drink in a moment. But basically, with overhydration, the problem is that you're actually diluting your blood system because you end up with so much fluid in your body that your blood starts to dilute. And really the blood, when you think about it, is transferring nutrients, minerals and oxygen to our body. And once you start altering the chemistry of the blood, it's not going to help us. So as unlikely as it is, people do die from overhydration. Now, I think, again, this comes back to urine colour here. If your urine, it looks like water, basically, it's that clear, almost water sort of appearance, it's probably an indication that you don't need to drink anymore. And use that as a guide. Because the symptoms of overhydration in its mildest form tend to be nausea and vomiting and headaches and mental confusion. Now, again, that can be very easily confused with dehydration, and if you assume that that's what's going on and you drink more water,
you're drinking more water.
All you're doing potentially is making it worse. Signs and symptoms in the case of severe overhydration can end up with seizures, unconsciousness, and coma. So, in this sort of instance, it's not a matter of giving people more water. It really is a matter of getting medical assistance as soon as you possibly can. Now, we talked about how much water you should drink, and as Jill mentioned, the average adult should be consuming roughly around about 2 to 2.5 litres of water per day, but that's in our normal day-to-day life. As soon as we start exerting ourselves, as soon as we start getting out in hot conditions, carrying a pack, that water usage is going to increase. And in fact, my biggest day of water consumption was roughly around about 8 litres, but that was on a day where I was travelling roughly 50-odd kilometres and the temperatures were in the mid to high 30s. So, in that instance there, I needed that amount of water spread over a period of the day to basically keep myself hydrated. What we've worked out over the last 4 or 5 years is that as a general rule of thumb, in cold conditions, and by cold I mean sort of under 20 degrees is a rough guide, that I'll use around about 1 litre of water for every 10 kilometres of walking. And for me, that translates to roughly 1 litre per 2 to 2 and a bit hours. And that gives me a good guide.
Yeah, I don't use quite as much as that while I'm walking, but I will top up at the end of the day and at the beginning of the day just to make sure.
Now, in hot conditions, And again, hot here is fairly subjective, but really once you start getting, from my perspective, over sort of 22, 23, 24 degrees, I will start working on around about 1 litre per hour. Now, again, I'll use urine colour as the guide, but in hot conditions, that's not an unusual amount of water to work with. Now let's move on to finding water on a hike. So we've talked about roughly how much water we're likely to need. So in other words, if you're doing a hike that's only 2 kilometres long, you may get away, particularly if it's in the cooler part of the year, just maybe not even carrying a water bottle, having water in your car for when you return to the trailhead, or if you're only carrying a small amount of water, either maybe a small water bottle or a partially filled water bladder. And from my perspective, typically I will always tend to carry water on hikes. I'd rather have it there available if I do get thirsty. And if there's any sort of doubt, or if it's hot weather, I'll tend to use that water because it really you're starting to sweat, and particularly in the hot conditions, it tends to be something that's you tend to need to carry with you. Now, my first comment here would be that not all water is created equal, and there's an image on one of the associated articles with this podcast of water that I actually collected not far from Canberra on the Australian Alps walking track. This was in autumn. I wasn't expecting to have to fill up from this particular location, but most of my usual water sources were dry, and the water source that I ended up using was very silty, and the best way to describe it was gelatinous. This was a farm dam. I don't know whether it was kangaroos or cows or horses. I didn't
probably all of the above.
Probably all of the above, but it really was. It was gelatinous. So, throwing a couple of water purification tablets into this sort of stuff wouldn't have done me a lot of good. Thankfully, I always tend to carry a water filter with me, and I really did need to use this water. I had no other choice. But yeah, it's the sort of thing that, there's clear running water, there's dirty water, and if you happen to be walking along coastal areas and you're getting water that's close to the ocean, you may find the water is actually salty or brackish, and may not be usable for drinking. So don't necessarily rely on the fact that just because there is water there, it is drinkable. And even if it is fresh water, you may still have to filter it anyway. Starting from the very basic from a water perspective on the trail, the first one to look at is built infrastructure. And by this, I mean either water bubblers, and a lot of trails, particularly with national parks these days, particularly on the shorter trails, will often have water bubblers on them, particularly if it's one of the main trails within the park. The lesser known trails or the more remote national parks aren't likely to have bubblers around, so you're likely to have to carry your water in with you. Longer tracks, it's not usual for very long trails to have dedicated, reliable, man-made water sources. But as an example here, Larapinta Trail in Northern Territory has water tanks at regular intervals at the start of the trail, at the finish of the trail, and at a number of the locations along the track itself. So you can actually rely on that water being there. It's monitored by the rangers, and it's topped up on a fairly regular basis. When we did the Larapinta Trail in 2016, one of the rangers we talked to said they don't like the tanks getting lower than around about 50%, and a number of these water tanks had water sensors that actually were connected to radio antennae that they were able to check back at headquarters rather than having to come out and check the water tanks manually. So this is a rarity when you're getting a trail over 200 kilometres that has man-provided water tanks, but certainly it does make it a lot easier. Most trails that we do tend not to have these water sources available, and you're having to rely on natural water sources. And this could be things along the lines of creeks, rivers, lakes, and dams. Now, first up with natural water sources, you need to know where they're likely to be. And really from this perspective, you need to do your research before you go on these hikes. It may be a matter of saying, look, I'm doing a 2-kilometre hike. I don't need to worry about what water's there. I've got water in the car. I'm carrying it with me. But on the longer hikes where you physically can't carry water for 2 or 3 or 4 days, you need to know where your replacement water sources are.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one because I find that it becomes a real serious focus of your day when you know that you're going to have to collect water along the way and you're not sure where it's going to be. You do become much more conscious and I think you are much more aware of it than perhaps your food, because you've got your food. You know what you're going to have when you're going to have it, but with the water, that you need to locate it.
Now, options for trying to find water are natural water sources, and there are a few. Certainly you find these days the internet provides trail write-ups for just about every trail in Australia. Now, not necessarily reliable, or you may be looking at reviews that were done 4 or 5 or 6 years ago on some trails, so you can't necessarily rely on them. But certainly trail write-ups, trail apps like the Guthook app. Now, that as an app, that doesn't deal with a huge number of trails. It tends to rely on doing the larger trails in Australia, but it's quite handy to say, well, look, there's a reliable water source at this location. And there are other apps available as well. Guidebooks, and last but not least, topographic maps are quite handy. Now, with topographic maps, they're becoming less and less common. Our main source of map suppliers in Australia, which was Geoscience Australia, is in the process of stopping the production of pre-produced maps. I think there still are some available, but most of them have gone now. But you can now go online and download maps for certain sections of trails around the country. Now, again, it's not going to help you for everywhere, but certainly provides you the ability to say, well, I'll download and print a paper map that I'll take with me and use that to find water sources. Now, as a general guide, you don't expect to go up to the top of a hill or a mountain and find water. Typically, you're looking for water sources in valleys, in gullies, and that relies on you being able to read a map to say, well, this is a gully, there's a blue line running through it, which indicates there's a water source there. It may not be a reliable water source, but that's where you're going to be tending to look at.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one because when we were doing Human Hovel, there were a couple of spots where the water source was quite concealed with overgrown plants and grass plants in particular, and you had to wade through. In my case, was knee or thigh high grass and shrubbery to get to the water source. The thing that worried me most was what was hiding in all of that grass, particularly the snakes. And when you got there, it wasn't the most generous flowing water source. So you had to really get in and you had to wait and you submerge. So sometimes it's a bit of a scary thing having to get your water. It's there. So it wasn't an issue in terms of wondering if there was going to be water there, but, actually wading through what was quite long grass to get to it was a bit of a challenge.
Now, having said all that, we did the Aussie 10 walk Christmas last year. And one of the things that surprised me, we finished the walk. The last summit for us was at Ram's Head, and this was we camped at a saddle that was just below the Ram's Head summit, and this was a saddle that was up high from the valley below, and there was a creek running down that saddle. So it surprised us. We had enough water that we took up with us just in case, because we weren't sure there was going to be water there. We were aware that there was potentially water up there, but we didn't want to rely on it. And as I said, we got up there and found that there was a small running stream that was quite usable. So we did end up using some of that water anyway. I think the other thing that you need to consider when locating water sources is seasonal reliability. Now, I'll give you an example here. The Australian Alpine area, when all the snow melts, so particularly in early to mid-spring, even late spring, there's still a lot of water running from the higher hills through all the water systems, and water tends to be fairly reliable. I had spent a fair amount of time in the Australian Alps close to Canberra over the last 5 to 6 years. And even during the height of summer, there were so many creeks and little rivers and little streams that you didn't really have to rely on water. And even during the mid-teens, when we had a fairly serious drought going on, it just surprised me how much water was available when we didn't think there was going to be any there at all.
Yeah, that's right.
Having said that, when I did a piece of the Australian Alps walking track at Easter in 2019, I was surprised at a number of the water sources that I relied on or had been relying on for the previous 5 to 6 years that just weren't there. The big streams, the big rivers were all flowing and they were all reliable, but a lot of the little creeks in between were pretty much disappeared. I made the mistake on the last day of the hike, thinking, yep, there's a water source coming up. I know it's there, and I got to it, and pretty much it was mud. There was moisture there, but there was so much sediment in there you couldn't actually get water into the filter to actually go through and do it. And this is why I ended up using the water source that I did. It wasn't by choice, it was just the one I really needed. I mean, I was so close to finishing the walk, but I really did need a drink, and that left me with a really dodgy water source. So I think you need to be careful about seasonal reliability on hikes, and in some cases the water's just not going to be there, and it may dictate that you do a hike at a particular time of the year to ensure that you have reliable water sources. Now, the key points I'd say here with using natural water resources, there are a few things you need to keep in mind. Firstly, you need to know how far you're going to travel and how much water you're going to consume, and that's going to vary depending on whether it's cold weather or warm weather. Where possible, try and choose or source your water from moving water sources such as creeks or rivers or larger lakes. Not always possible. Always filter your water, no matter how clean it looks. And I'll use as an example here, walking through the Australian Alpine areas in that Kiandra to Tharwa walk that I did in 2019. I counted 200 horses, and just about every water source I came across, they had actually crossed it, and you could see hoof marks in the shallower areas. And a lot of these horses are loaded with parasites, worms and all sorts of other things. So again, even though the water may look clear, you really do want to go through and filter where you can. And choosing cleaner water that's moving is as a better option if you've got no other choice. If the water is dirty, use a pre-filter, and it may just be as simple as a buff. So, if you're...
So when you say dirty, if it's got lumpy bits in it?
Yeah, so it might be leaf litter, it might even just be sediment, so it's dirty with sediment, and it means that rather than trying to put dirt into a water filter, which will then potentially clog it, removing a lot of that sediment before it runs through the actual filter itself is going to be a better option. Check water in any creeks and rivers that are close to the ocean before filling up. You don't want to load your water storage container with salt water. A filter's not going to get rid of all that. So you really need to make sure that if you are choosing water or filling up from water, it's far enough away from the ocean and high enough from the water level at sea level that you're not actually collecting salty water, brackish water. And quite often it's not unusual to have these creeks and rivers that are sealed off because of the movement of the ocean and the sands blocking them, but the water behind it is actually still salt water. Avoid drinking water from water sources that are through farms. Again, they may contain contaminants from animals or they may contain chemicals. So pesticides, herbicides, you don't know if it's been used. And on my very recent short walk on the Great North Walk, only a few weeks ago, I came across signs in a couple of areas saying, do not drink this water. It may contain sewage or chemical contamination. So again, that's not a particularly good thing you want to see. And unless you actually have a water purifier with you, a filter is not particularly going to help you in that sort of area. My last comment is to know what your plan is if you run low or run out of water. And this may mean taking a detour off trail to a reliable water source, or even stopping your hike if it means that you've run out of water, dehydration is starting to become an issue and you need to get out of there. And if it's serious enough, you may have to set off your emergency locator beacon. Waiting to magically find water isn't necessarily a good thing. You never want to be in that sort of situation, but if something's happened where you've just run out of water or your water bladder or your water bottle is broken and you just have no water, getting to a serious dehydrated level is not a good thing, and that's really a life-threatening situation at its worst. So what is it you're going to do and when are you going to set off your beacon if that is the case? Yeah,
and I think that's one of those things you need to talk to your safety person about, the person that's going to notice when you don't come back, and talk through all the sorts of different possibilities, and not locating water or having a problem with not being able to store your water, say in your bottle or in your bladder, is one of those things that's quite important to talk through.
Now, if you are relying on natural water and there's any sort of doubt about the reliability of the water sources, be conservative. Don't just have enough water to get you to the next water source. If you get there and find out that it's dry and there's no water there, really you're then going to have to move on to the next one with the assumption that there's water in that one, which there may also not be as well.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's better to have enough to get you past that water source and get you at least to a comfortable fashion to the next option. And if the water reliability is that doubtful, look at changing the time of the year you're doing your walk. One thing you may find is that more so in the desert areas, but it may be that you want to do a hike, there are no reliable water sources, and the only option is to cache water. And when we're talking about caching, we're talking about storing food or water for future use. Now, it's not unusual to cache food. So, as an example, on the Human Hovel track, on the Australian Alps walking track, there's not a lot of towns that you're passing through. So you need to actually go through and put food out to collect as you go through. And that means that you're either going to have to meet someone at a particular road as you pass, or you're going to have to go through, like we did with the Human Hovel track. We went through and dropped off some food at one of the caravan parks, which was only 2 days in. and then dropped off a batch of food in the middle of a forest at a location that we could relocate again that would carry us through to the end of the walk. Now, this is a bit of extra logistical requirement. It requires you dropping off. In our case, it was only food, but it may be that you need to drop off water. If you're doing that, the containers you're dropping off need to be not obvious, so that people don't find this and think, oh, I'll collect it and take it away. It also needs to be animal proof.
Robust,
so it's animal proof. And in my case, we actually went through and sprayed it almost a eucalyptus green colour, just so it was really hard to spot, because the bright blue colour that it was just a bit obvious. Whereas, we basically walked off track around about 80 or 90 metres, but it was somewhere that we would obviously know where it was. And we basically cable tied this thing to a tree, just so it was going to be knocked around and moved by animals if they did happen to come across us.
So you have to be able to locate it, hide it sufficiently, conceal it sufficiently, but also be able to locate it. And we had a GPS waypoint, and we also had some images so that we could recognise as we were approaching it, making sure that we were heading in the right direction. So, it was an interesting moment when we went, are we in the right place?
And it's always one of those sort of things when you're caching, whether it's food or water, you get there and think, oh, it's gone. Now, it hasn't happened to us, but I have heard of people that they've either lost it and can't remember where it was, or they've put it somewhere too obvious and someone's come and collected it thinking, oh, no, it's not necessary. So from our perspective, I actually put a label on the lid and covered it in waterproof contact saying, we expect to pick this up at this date, please do not remove. Because if someone's doing what they think is a favour by removing rubbish, and it's actually our food or water supply. Now, as a final thought on this, basically what it comes down to is, particularly on the longer hikes, is to do your research. Know where your water sources are going to be, know where they're potentially going to be an issue, and know if you need to go through and cache. And from my perspective, I don't just plan on how far I'm going to be walking each day, where I'm going to be camping, if I need to do food pickups. I also plan about where my water resupplies are. And if there's any doubt at all, I will carry extra water. In some cases I'll plan on camping in a situation where there is no water source. So as an example of this, Brinkley's Bluff on the Larapinta Trail, you're basically up the top of a hill. You get some spectacular views for sunset and sunrise, but there is no water.
Yeah, that's right.
So you have to carry water with you, which is what we did on that particular hike.
Yeah, so what we did, we carried water for the day that it took to get there for the overnight, and then for the journey back down again until we located water.
Okay, that's all for this week's episode. As mentioned, there are 2 associated articles with this podcast, and we'll put the links to those in the show notes, as well as a couple of other water-based articles that we've done previously that will be helpful. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. That's all for me. Bye for now.
And bye from me.